Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the National Gallery of the Cayman Islands. It's a real delight today to be sharing the panel with visiting curator and art historian, Dr. Veerle Poupeye, who is part of the curatorial team for 81 Degrees West. I also have our lead curator of the project, William Helfrecht, who is the National Gallery's collections curator, and I am Natalie Urquhart, director of the National Gallery and part of this curatorial team. And we're here today really just to have an informal conversation about how the exhibition developed, to maybe tease out some of the key themes and sub-themes of the exhibition, and to really look at the impact of cartography on the Caymanian contemporary art scene and some of the exciting new works that we're seeing in the next generation of artists. So, Will, maybe you could kick off with telling us a little bit about how the exhibition came together and an introduction to those sub-themes that we will be exploring tonight.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Well, mapping is a fascinating subject, and I think here in Cayman there are quite a few people, and we're aware now to a much greater extent, there's a lot of people who are interested in maps. It's this kind of fascinating visual language that has been well documented, but I think what makes this project interesting and slightly different is thinking about parallels between this visual universe of cartography, which for many people is, it's rooted in exploration, it's rooted in conquest, it's rooted in colonial narratives, but also, there's often a sort of dichotomy that's presented between the scientific and the aesthetic, for example. And I think when you start looking at some of these documents or these visual artifacts, you start to see on the one hand, the sort of visual artistry that exists in what for many people are these very plain sort of empirical scientific documents, and that's not the case, at least certainly not in these earlier iterations of maps from the early 1500s and into the 17th century, but also thinking about how maps have influenced the practice of visual artists and contemporary artists on both a literal level, and we will talk about this a little bit when we address the sort of structure of this exhibition, but then moving into the contemporary sphere, thinking about how less maps, but this idea of the cartographic, if you want to call it that, or this cartographic impulse, how that's translated by contemporary artists, some of them very young, who are emerging artists who are represented in the latter part of this exhibition.
Thank you, and of course, Veerle, you joined our curatorial team partway through the exhibition, and I know this is an area that you, as an art historian, have been very interested in exploring for many years, so there was great synergy there. So maybe talk a little bit about the research that you've done in terms of how maps, of course, as we know, have structured both our lived identity here, but also these histories, both in a very problematic sense, but also in a sense that almost gives a platform for that imagination and that exploration.
Right. I think the fascinating thing about maps is, as Will just pointed out, is that it is often in a field where the imagination and science meet, right? And science, well, when I say science, I mean a particular kind of knowledge that is informed by particular premises. And I think in the Caribbean, the early maps are really quite fascinating in terms of what they represent, because they were often made by people who never came here. Right? Who had no idea what the Caribbean looked like or felt like, and so on, and who went by the descriptions, by the notes, by the information that was relayed to them by the initial colonial conquerors. And then you see that imaginary changing over time as a particular vision of the world unfolds as colonization continues. And I think the fascinating thing is also that the technology of maps is not neutral, right? It's not neutral information. I mean, notoriously, for instance, the Mercator projections put Europe in the center of the global universe, and that has, of course, one of the things with a global map is you need to put a round object you need to represent it in a flat form, but of course, pretty much any point on the globe could have been used as the center of that projection, right? So basically, the way that was done historically put Europe at the center of that universe and everything else sort of in the periphery as also sort of the unknown territories that gradually became known. So it's a particular kind of knowing. And if you compare that to early Chinese maps and so on, you see, for instance, the different kind of perspective emerging. So I think maps are really fascinating for that reason, because it is a way of expressing a particular understanding of the world, but it also represents a particular way of ordering the world, of exerting control over that world. And often in those maps you have subtle and not so subtle indications of ownership, right? I mean, in terms of who owns this place. And that is often what maps are for. To really assert the ownership of a particular country, of a particular lot of land. I mean, it can be at different levels. But I think one of the extraordinary things that this wall also drives home is that maps also are often extraordinary works of art. Right? I mean, that the aesthetic side of it is also important, and that the imagination remains an important part of all but the most utilitarian kinds of maps. You know, most of them have illustrations attached to it. There is some form of imaginary attached. And how that then pans out in the work of artists, I think, is particularly fascinating in the case of the Cayman Islands. But it also is something that you see throughout the Caribbean, because the map is sort of a recurrent theme in Caribbean art. Something that artists have reflected on critically, that they have responded to in terms of the political significance of maps. It often goes with ideas about national identity. For instance, the map is an important subject in the art of Puerto Rico, and of course Puerto Rico, being a US dependency, has this sort of struggle of asserting a national identity. So the map takes on a particular meaning in that. And how that then pans out in the visual arts, how the artists work with that, I think is fascinating. But the Cayman Islands, of course, being a society with a particular maritime history, have an additional layer of engagement with that subject. And I think that's why this exhibition is so interesting and timely.
And I think because obviously the audience can't see this wall of maps behind us, we maybe be able to get some of those images woven in later on. Let's start with the very beginning. Let's start with the actual scientific maps, and because I think even in this journey that we've taken in exploring some of these maps, it has already started to help us unpack some of those preconceptions that we have, particularly when we're looking at this 1502 map. Obviously the Cayman Islands put a lot of weight on this concept of discovery by Columbus, which we know is highly problematic. There's no recorded history of a peoples before that, but we can understand that people would have used Cayman potentially more temporarily for fishing and stopping. But this map has really raised some questions, I think. So if you want to speak to that, Will, and then we'll talk a little bit about those aesthetics around the different types of maps, from the early colonial maps to later maps of trade routes, and these sort of the movement of economy around the Caribbean, I think is very interesting as well. So moving from this early point of discovery to then continuing to set these boundaries around how people move across the region. So, Will.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Veerle, to your point, this idea of this structuring of knowledge and sort of the power structures that are inscribed in these documents, I think is something that's very important to note. I always think of visiting Greenwich in London, and the Greenwich meridian runs through the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, and of course there's this people often have fun sort of standing, bestraddling the line, the zero line of time, as it were. But it really speaks to your point about this centering of the European kind of colonial status. In terms of the maps and these historical documents, as Natalie was saying, we have a couple of interesting and maps that I'd never seen before in this exhibition, and one of which is the Cantino planisphere, named after the explorer Alberto Plantino, And it's called a planisphere, and it was originally inscribed on a long, almost like a scroll, really. So this often on animal hide. And what's interesting about that map for here in Cayman, in the Caymanian context, is, as Natalie said, the very clear and unequivocal presence of these 3 dots to the northwest of Jamaica. And the cartographer wasn't perfectly accurate, but they are very clearly from the orientation Grand Cayman and the sister islands. And so I think that map in particular, and it also is noted, or notable, it's got some interesting details. We were talking about these blank spaces. So the African continent in that map is really this vast unknown. I mean, the interior of the Sahara is this tabula rasa, this blank slate. But I think that the presence of Cayman on that map is really quite telling in terms of this narrative. And even in the course of research, thinking about Columbus, well, I wasn't actually aware that, of course, it wasn't Christopher Columbus himself, it was his son, Ferdinand Columbus, who sighted not Grand Cayman, but the sister islands. And then a couple of other historical, we can talk about these various maps, but one other I wanted to point to is a map that we've featured in this exhibition that came from the collection of the British Library. We were able to request permission to reproduce a facsimile of that map. And that is a map by the French explorer called Pierre de Sellier from 1550. And as you were saying about this Mercator projection, this idea of centering the European, well, as we know, also in those sort of cartographic representations, there are distortions of scale. And what's notable about this map is not so much a distortion of scale, but it's the inversion of the conventional hierarchy of the north, south, east, west axis, where the Caribbean in this map, which is the focal point of the map, from our perspective appears upside down. So we're looking from the Canadian colonial dominion of Canada, looking down or up, depending which way you look at it, but the Caribbean is inverted. So Jamaica, which is normally this sort of crescent, appears upside down, as does Jamaica, Hispaniola, and so on. So I think that really speaks to this question of positionality and how the Caribbean was perceived, represented by colonial power. So, and one last point about the maps, because we came across all kinds of fascinating maps, some of which are well known to people here in Cayman. So we've borrowed, or again reproduced with permission from our National Archives, the Gould survey map from 1773, which is one of the best known maps of Grand Cayman. It was the first Royal Navy survey of Grand Cayman. And I think what's really fascinating when you look at that document is, on the one hand, the accuracy, surprising accuracy, the contours, they did a very good job, really, quite an exhaustive process. But then there's also this element of the kind of speculative, the imaginative, the interior, the central mangrove swamp is essentially this unknown forest, right? So the surveying was really concerned with things like depth soundings and things measuring depths for anchorage purposes and so on, and for maritime navigation. So there's a lot to unpack in the historical maps themselves.
And I think as well, it's very telling that we're sort of on this journey through history as well in Cayman, because we haven't really, I think this might be the first time we've ever brought these maps together from so many different sources. I know the Little Cayman Museum have a really wonderful display of antique maps, and I know the National Archive, which we've actually reproduced a couple of maps from. The National Museum have several in their collection, but this is the first time we've sort of brought this many maps together. And I think it's quite fascinating in terms of that evolution from seeing something like Cayman written in the traditional sense, in the 1616 map we have. Don't want the alarms to go off in the National Gallery. 1616, and we have the Cayman spelling of the crocodile, which is clearly where our name derived from. Following immediately on from this concept of Las Tortugas, which we do not see in any of these maps. And in that journey, even some of the later maps starting to see very important geographical locations within the island. So I think by the mid-1800s, we start seeing Boddentown referenced, Northside referenced, and Georgetown as well. So obviously we always hark back to this concept of teaching tools. This is really a remarkable collection to have brought together, and we're hoping, I think, to spark a lot more imagination in the unpacking of these visuals and the story that they tell collectively. Yeah.
I'm also fascinated by how in the layout of the maps you have used...
Which is Will's concept,
I know.
and we can help to make it happen.
You have used basically the contours of Grand Cayman, which of course are almost immediately recognizable. And it goes to this idea that national maps are also sort of national logos, you know, that they sort of become identified with a particular concept of identity. People wear pendants in the shape of those maps and so on with pride, you know, because it's sort of a statement, this is where I'm from. So the map becomes a lot more than just a wayfinding tool, which is technically what a map really is. It becomes a symbol of this nation, you know, and that familiarity. You know, you see the shape and immediately you know, it's Grand Cayman. I mean, the sister islands might be a bit upset with you, but
if we're going to travel the show, we're going to have to rethink the layout. That's for sure. And we do hope to do that. Actually, I think it would be very fitting in a place like the Little Cayman Museum that are already spending quite a lot of time in their collection looking at these earlier stories through maps. That could be our next phase. So I think that's a really nice departure then to move on from the maps themselves through this aesthetic of the placement of how the maps are laid out, and again we'll try and slot an image of that into the discussion, into the next phase of the exhibition. And of course we're going on this journey through this very literal use of maps in the work of our contemporary artists, and I think a lot of this exhibition was inspired by the father of Caymanian art, Bendel Hydes, and the work in his collection. This has been very central to his practice throughout his career. And then further on, as we move away from that to this very contemporary interpretation and response to this more conceptual use of mapping. But Will, do you want to speak to that and the journey that we move through?
Well, I think, and Veerle, you're familiar with Bendel's work, very well familiar. And I think in terms of this idea of mapping and using, I guess, the exhibition as a vehicle for a narrative journey, right, that unfolds from the historical through to the literal, and then into the symbolic, the abstract, and finally the conceptual. For this project, I think what we were really interested in is using this notion of the cartographic as a sort of unifying principle, allowing us to explore the work of artists who, in one sense, whose practices are quite distinct, and yet share something, and trying to put your finger exactly on what that thing is. So on the wall here, actually beside us, we also were able to borrow some historical navigational tools from the Cayman Islands National Museum. And so you can see there a sextant, a pair of compasses, a parallel rule, which is a survey instrument used in surveying, and of course the spyglass, the antique spyglass. And so for this exhibition, those four objects are kind of used as these symbolic emblems. So what I mean by that is each object is used to represent a particular action, a particular animating force, if you will. So the spyglass, for example, can be seen to symbolize this idea of exploration, but also of observation, right? That is to say of, in the early moment of colonial exploration and conquest, these were explorers who were going into an unknown land. And of course, we know there were indigenous populations across the Caribbean. And so there's a lot of that mythology which has really been debunked. But from the European perspective, this idea of experiencing for the first time, exploring, which is a very romanticized notion. Likewise, the compasses and the sextant obviously are synonymous with navigation and recording waypoints, and actually this idea of voyaging, which is, metaphorically really speaks to Cayman's maritime history, which we've talked about. And then finally, as I said, this last instrument, the survey instrument, what we tried to do with this exhibition is to tie the artworks themselves, and we can go into a bit more detail about the artists in this show, but to tie them to these historical moments in Cayman's history. So we've talked about this origin story, and we're in this first corridor of the space. We then move into this idea of circumnavigation. And so we've sort of paralleled these ideas of exploration in the work of some of our pioneering artists, so artists such as Bendel Hydes, but sort of paralleling that to a historical moment in Caymanian history, which really stretches from, settlement, but well into the 20th century of mariners and turtle fishermen and seafarers. And then moving more into the modern era, I think by the time we get to the 1970s, obviously we get shifts stylistically in the works that we're seeing. We see the emergence of several artists in this show using kind of more symbolic forms of representation, so getting away from the sort of literal incorporation of collage, which you see in the work of Bendel Hydes, where he's literally using collage fragments of maps in the surfaces of his works, to artists who are kind of expanding upon that and using this idea of mapping in a much more expansive way. And finally, we come to this final group, which is entitled New Horizons, and that's really looking at, how far can we stretch this analogy, right? This notion of the cartographic when we come into the contemporary era, and we have some of our young Caymanian artists who are exploring new media, new technologies. They're looking at, say, the digital sphere as a new space of exploration. So how does that tie back to these older, more established artists such as Bendel Hydes, and what are the sort of through lines that we can see that connect their work?
And I think, even in Bendel's own work, that evolution is quite fascinating. And we start and end the show with two major pieces of Bendel Hydes' work. So maybe, Veerle, you can talk a little bit more about that journey of literal exploration in Bendel's early practice of this collage and working very tangibly with maps. And then, one of our final pieces in the show is this remarkable work from one of his final major series, Circumnavigating the Globe, which actually opened the National Gallery of the Cayman Islands. It's a 12-part series that literally starts and ends in the Cayman Islands. The show is harking back to some of the terminology that Bendel uses. So maybe we could speak a little bit further to Bendel's own journey and use that then to discuss some of the other artists in the show.
Well, it is in fact through his use of references to maps and navigation and so on that I first got drawn into the work. I think I first met Bendel and first saw his work at an exhibition which was held in Miami in 1992 or 1993, somewhere in the mid-1990s. And I think it was Cayo's mosquitoes that I saw there. And well, I'm married to a geologist who actually makes maps for a living. So maps are part of my life in another kind of way. So I was immediately drawn to it because maps are also history. They tell stories, right? I mean, and automatically you're also reminded in the context of Cayman and the way artists like Bendel have engaged with that, with the fact that the sea is history, right? As Derek Walcott reminded us. So there is a whole lot that is sort of a whole lot of baggage that comes with these sort of images, and I think Bendel has engaged with that, I think, in a very interesting way, which brings back to those histories being from a seafaring family and so on, but also which allows for other sort of metaphors to be brought into the equation. I mean, life stories. I mean, in a sense, our lives are a trajectory. They're a journey in a sense, and I think that also comes back into it. What I'm also interested in, and that sort of takes me away a little bit from what you asked specifically with Bendel, but is this interplay, I think, in the context of Cayman, of sort of the formal use of maps and navigation and then popular knowledge. The fact that those turtle fishermen found their way using other means than sort of the formal the formal map. So I think this interplay between sort of the informal forms of navigation that we all use in our lives in various ways, the popular, the vernacular knowledge that comes with that, and then how that relates to how navigation happens based on formal maps and so on. You know, there's an interesting tension there. You know, but returning to Bendel's work, I mean, I think one interesting thing about this exhibition is also that it really drives home that, you know, in a sense, the creation of a work of art is a form of mapping. You know, the creation of a painting, of a drawing on a two-dimensional surface. And it's also interesting to see that interplay between sort of the active references to mapping, navigation, cartography in the work of Bendel hides, and then the fact that the work itself has a lot in common, you know, as does the work of a lot of the other artists in the exhibition, has a lot in common in terms of how it creates a particular space, a particular narrative, how it translates a particular set of ideas on a two-dimensional surface in the case of paintings, I think is an interesting thing to look at too. I have sort of meandered in and out.
No, I think that also touches very much so on Bendel's work, because he's also functioning as a historian.
Right.
You know, if you talk about this informal navigation, and you know, we're very fortunate here to have been able to host and hear the stories of so many of our seafarers, and the informality of that, and the sort of lack of these very formal tools was remarkable, and he's going back, tracing those stories that wouldn't necessarily have been captured or documented. So functioning both as artist and historian, I think, is a very interesting segue actually into the next series of works as well. So we have people like John Broad that are again following that tradition, are very tangibly using maps as collage, and this sort of kind of rediscovery and this overpainting now, very much so in John's work. Maybe we could speak briefly to that. I don't think we can get through every single artist in the show. We'll be here all night. But I think a couple of let's unpack a couple of the works in each of the subsections, so we can speak further to the art itself.
Well, I think this idea of expanding beyond the literal. We've talked about Bendel's work. John Broad is. As Natalie said, I think he is really using the map as a ground for illustration, as the surface of inscription itself. So that's an interesting proposition, and particularly now in this moment of kind of rapid change and development, the maps that he's using, in one instance, he actually uses a variation of the 1882 Admiralty map, which is obviously a historical document. But a lot of them are actually taken from street atlases, from magazine publications. And what you see, of course, is the development, right? This network of roads and interconnecting lines and the subdivisions that have sort of proliferated. And so there's a tension in his work, I think, between this historical sort of memory-keeping impulse that's figured in the subjects of his work, which are these historical figures wearing traditional dress, often you know, carrying a ground basket in a couple of instances, and the sort of jarring dissonance of these very, very contemporary urban landscapes. But moving into some of the more contemporary works in the show, or at least in terms of media, we talked about this idea of the mental map, and one work that I think you were struck by, and we can talk about this, was the painting by Al Ebanks, which is called Walking on Shedden Road. And I can let you sort of have a comment on that piece, but you know, we talked about this idea of the mental map, of how individuals experience a place in an embodied way, and also the role of memory as places change over time, how that the specificity of place is really inscribed in a work like that, this idea of memory.
Yeah. And I think interesting in that work is sort of the interplay between how mapping solidifies a particular environment, also very interestingly portrayed in Davin Evans' work, of course, dealing with water, but how he sort of makes that fluid again, because it's almost like the houses are floating around in this sort of imaginary, imaginary space. So I think it's a really fascinating work in terms of how it plays on the familiar, but it also talks about what changes, what disappears, what is morphing. So it's sort of between documentation and then memory in a sense.
There's no fixed central point, is it?
No.
Right.
These
And
houses
it's jumbled up, so it's not in the right order.
Yeah, it breaks all the rules.
reflection of the landscape, because often many of them are no longer there. So that sort of, so you see a transition between the literal and the memory is really quite, it's a very powerful piece that we had exhibited quite recently in a solo show of his that again struck us, I think, when we were rebuilding this. And other pieces in that corridor, I think, moving on to a much younger artist, Cameron Bridgman, whose father, David Bridgman, is, of course, is well represented in the exhibition as well. And David's practice has been very, very rooted in, again, this sort of both the literal mapping and the conceptual, and this journey that he's been on for many years about sort of looking at this dual identity that he has as a new Caymanian who has come from the UK, and very much basing that exploration in landscape. It's been very interesting to see Cameron as a sort of next generation artist being somewhat influenced by his father's practice, but also taking it to the next level in the way that he is working with collage and sort of very physically cutting up and repurposing and creating these new landscapes. So maybe, Will, you could talk a little bit more about Cameron's practice.
Yeah. Well, I think to Natalie's point, also we've talked about this concept of the transcultural. And what's interesting about an artist like Cameron Bridgman, a young artist who's been away at art school in the UK, completed his MFA degree. Originally that series, variations from that series were presented in our biennial exhibition. And originally those were fairly conventional collage type works that used kind of cut up fragments of magazines and so on. And of course a lot of the street names, this sort of vernacular references, were from England. These were street names of Brighton and Sussex and so on. And so I think as he's come home and come back to Cayman, he's an artist whose studio overlooks this sort of industrial park and this slightly kind of dystopian landscape. So I mean, he's very aware, I think, in terms of looking out of the window of his studio, of this idea of constant change and development. And even as a young artist, I think everyone can identify with this feeling of nostalgia on the one hand, but also a sort of sense of that feeling of being unsettled by this sort of relentless change. And so that's really reflected in the fragmentation that you see in his work, the radical juxtapositions that appear in this technique. And it's also one, I think, interestingly, he explores this idea of the map as a medium. So that series of work is presented almost like architectural blueprints that are physically tacked to the wall. So he's playing with this idea of visual registers, and rather than treating the surface as this, the stretched canvas, the sanctity of the original work of art, it's got this very tactile and very utilitarian quality of an actual informational document. Yeah.
And there's the mapping of the physical environment, but one of the fascinating sort of recurring themes in contemporary Caribbean art especially is the body as map, or the island as a body, and how that then again speaks to particular memories, to particular histories, told and untold, sort of the submerged stories in the landscape, and I think it's not very strongly present in this exhibition, but it begins to be there in the more recent work. You'll have to forgive me, I forgot his name.
Yes, Brandon Saunders.
Let's talk about Brandon, because
Brandon.
it's a great example of moving into that area of exploration.
right? And then sort of this exploding map of the body and so on. So it both becomes something that sort of makes things known in a sense, but it can also do the opposite. You know, it can sort of shatter it into pieces. So I think that's a fascinating development in this context, that the body also comes into the equation.
And this is Brandon Saunders, who's a young, predominantly digital artist, who is at Ruskin College in Oxford doing his master's in digital art. But he's been producing some really exciting work, I think, for many years. Yeah. He first was exhibited at the National Gallery in a major show at the age of 17. Mm-hmm. So very interesting artist. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a great, so we're sort of, while again the audience can't see this, we've meandered down the corridor into sort of a separate area that's really looking at a very sort of very different, I think, approaches, very contemporary approaches to this subject. So maybe we could talk about a couple of other different pieces in there. We have Simon Tatum with another digital installation work, Carrie Ann Chisholm and Latoya Francis and their piece. So maybe we can speak to both of those works before concluding in the final room.
Yeah, I think this idea of the body as map is very instructive, and it actually, I think for me, contradicts this famous quote by Samuel Johnson, who said that no man is an island. But of course, Brandon Saunders' work, he's actually talking about this, he's spoken about this, this digital print that's on view in the exhibition, and he specifically remarked how this sort of fragmentation of the body, because these are really self-portraits. It's a two-part work that's on view in the exhibition. One is a digital projection using a technology called UV mapping. So, and the other part of that, it's a two-part work, as I say, is really an attempt to translate the three-dimensional scan into a two-dimensional surface. So the work has been created through various technological efforts, and Brandon said to me that when he was envisioning this sort of representation of, and it's really a work that speaks to cultural identity as well, and heritage, and the sort of multiple origin points of both, for him autobiographically, but people across the Caribbean more generally, talking about how that figuration almost itself resembles an archipelago of islands, you know, and you start to see these patterns and these shapes. So Brandon's work is also, as Natalie said, it's really exploring, and I hate to use this sort of romanticized language, but this idea of the new frontier, but in this case, the new frontier of digital space. So thinking about the applications of digital technology as a medium for contemporary art practice. And speaking of some of the other artists in that final group, this New Horizons group, we have Caitlin Elphinstone, and in a similar fashion, but taking a different approach, she is an artist who has started exploring the applications of using artificial intelligence, so AI. And Natalie had earlier remarked this idea of kind of authorship, the idea of the original work of art, but thinking about how authorship can be, you know, either held singularly by the artist, but also conferred, or if you will, kind of divested by using something like artificial intelligence that really brings up all these issues of, you know, who is the artist? Also, in that work, what I think is interesting is this concept of hybridity. So thinking about multiple authorship, but also the appropriation of images. So we haven't really described that work, that series, Artificial Renderings, but it is based on black and white archival photographs, many of them from the National Archives, that have been manipulated or otherwise altered by this process of allowing the machine, right, the intelligent machine, to arbitrarily, in some cases, alter these images. And that can include the obscuring of faces, strange manipulations that give the work quite an uncanny quality. But it's really about this idea of mapping the archive, looking at social histories and the construction of bodies and so on. So we can talk about that. And finally, talking about Carrie-Anne Chisholm and Latoya Francis's work. And this is a good, I think, point about how you know, some of the open call exhibitions we do, or a wide-scale project like the Biennial, has this afterlife, right? We see artists who produce work for an exhibition like that, and it really pays dividends because we're seeing them work on new series of work, and often it'll lead to this sort of theme and variation. So several of the artists in this show, we were kind of thinking about their Biennial project, which was a quite different exhibition, but how they could expand or reformulate that. So this was the case with Carrie-Anne Chisholm and Latoya Francis's project. And we talked about mental mapping. This is really, we were tried quite hard to reference the origins of that project because it was a quite a conceptually complex, site-specific installation and intervention into a historic site in Northside, with this accompanying documentary component, the archiving of that project through photographic documentation. So there's a sort of relationship between this sort of physical remote site and then the documentation of this community project, which was really conceived as something that was concerned with this idea of community, activating community, empowering voices in the community, and then recording and sharing those conversations. So translating that into the gallery for this exhibition, the idea was really to focus on this archive, this documentary archive, as a remnant of a now past performance, and thinking about how, you know, something like the Polaroid picture, which is now something that's considered somewhat anachronistic, right? A film photograph, how those inscribe and record the location at which they were taken, and thinking about the representation of an archive as a kind of map, a map of these social relations, a map of the places in which these encounters happened, and how you visualize that within the context of, you know, the more neutral space of the contemporary gallery.
And I think that project particularly, you know, conventional mapping is sort of a disciplinary intervention into a particular space. It's a sort of external imposition on the space. And how in this particular thing, the mapping is sort of internalized in the community and generated from within the community by the memories, the locations, the stories, and so on that accompany it. So it's sort of an interesting pushback, a sort of alternative cartography that also reminds me of this concept of alternative geographies, right? There's a lot of discussion for the moment about black geographies as a kind of pushback to sort of the conventional sort of scientific geographies that focus on particular kinds of knowledge, how there are other kinds of knowledge that need to be unearthed, that need to be allowed to speak, that need to be given form in a way that does not repeat those disciplinary interventions. You know, so I think that it's a very interesting project. So very glad that it is part of the exhibition. Yeah. And well, then again, the way the images are organized, you know, that also that I thought also was a really interesting.
And that was to echo the landscape of Northside, where the project is based, loosely. But it really does sit very well at the other side of the conversation from these very traditional maps with a sense of control and external ownership.
Yeah. And that takes us back to Al Ebanks and the way, you know, the community sort of is organized in that painting. And
the shed and road painting as well. So then we'll move into the final corridor. And speak to that, and then I think we'll talk about the next steps, because of course I think the curatorial team have had a lot of well, I'm going to say fun, because you can have fun at work as well, but it's been such a fascinating subject that I think we're very keen to continue exploring. So we'll speak about the potential future of the exhibition and some of the thoughts that we have for an ongoing journey relating to the topic. So in the final space, you referenced Davin Ebanks, and of course I think you can possibly see Davin Ebanks's really wonderful 80 degrees west meridian, which was the central point of his 2009 show of the same name. This is one of two works we have of Davin's in the show, both from the National Collection, and we should say a lot of the works in this exhibition are drawn from the National Collection of the Galleries, obviously that's held in trust on behalf of the people of the Cayman Islands. Davin's work speaks so well for itself. He's works primarily in glass, and in the central stage we've brought back together what's actually two different artworks through various collectors. It took a little bit of sleuthing. Looking again, it's a work that's very much based in the physical space, an exploration of the sort of movement from a sort of depths of the ocean as a fisherman. He's a fly fisherman and has spent a lot of time studying these varying depths of the shore coming out of the water. And I think that's a very wonderful piece of to anchor that final discussion on, both in terms of its incredible execution, but the way it speaks to the subject as well.
And well, one idea that I sort of want to also bring into the discussion here, you could also argue that the curatorial labor is also a form of cartography in many ways, right? And I think both in terms of how you select, how you then exhibit, how you structure the narrative of the exhibition and so on. So there's some interesting, parallels there too, and something that you can very actively work with in an exhibition. So.
Well, I think programming is a very important part of what we do at the National Gallery. So I mean, there are some sort of playful references throughout the show, and we talked about the historical instruments. So of course 81 degrees west, the title, which we haven't talked about, is obviously quite literally it's the geographic coordinates of Grand Cayman. But these instruments as well, we've sort of used them as these organizing principles, and if you look closely, the labels, these four sort of thematic groupings, have a little design motif in the corner of each of these instruments. So kind of as a visual cue, if you will, just to sort of reference these groupings. But we're really keen on kind of, I think, bringing our educational programs into the space when they come for school tours and so on, and talking about subjects that are tied to the national curriculum, but also kind of letting the children sort of explore for themselves and kind of engage with this exhibition in a very playful way. This idea of exploring the space, but also learning at the same time about some of this really critical Caymanian cultural history.
And I think one of the final works in the show, on that note, because it roots us back in this journey, and I reference, of course, Bendel's Las Tortugas, which is, again, one of these 12 remarkable works that he created in 2010, exhibited here for the first time in 2012, which is a literal journey of the artists around the globe, starting and ending in Cayman. So obviously the choice of this particular work was very, very fitting as a conclusion to this dialogue. And again, really shows that journey of the artist himself from that more literal interpretation of maps to this very, very large, oversized, remarkable abstract. And also sharing the story that it does tell the same journey of this maritime heritage in the abstraction as it does in the literal, which has been a very interesting dialogue to have with our audience in Cayman too. So what about next steps? I think we can allude to ongoing research. Obviously we don't have anything finite yet, but I think we're very keen to continue this dialogue and perhaps opening it up to the region and exploring the story through the work of other artists practicing.
Right, because right now the exhibition pretty much pertains to the Cayman Islands, specifically the specific histories. But of course, there is a broader story there for the Caribbean. So that one thing that one would like to do is to bring that story into the equation and to bring what is in this exhibition, what is represented in this exhibition, into dialogue with those bigger stories. For instance, in terms of the various critical, metaphorical uses of maps and cartography. I mean, there's a whole story about that in Caribbean art, generally speaking. That makes for a very, very fascinating exhibition. So I do hope that we can move in that direction and bring in some of these works and these artists and see how they have, from different experiences, and the one in the Cayman Islands here, how they have also engaged with the sort of issues that are engaged with in these exhibitions. So I'm very keen on that part too
Absolutely.
Of this exhibition.
And I think we talked very briefly as well about the, sort of the new cartography, the new futures, the imaginary, the imaginary locations and worlds, whether referencing climate change and this ongoing evolution
critical
of what
cartographies and
that imagery might look like. So lots to unpack and move forward with. Any final thoughts?
Well, I just thinking about this idea of abstraction in that final room, and that group is titled "To the Ends of the Earth." So it's this constant return to a historic, cultural, thematic that's very much rooted in the Caymanian experience, but really taking the viewer on this journey into abstraction. So thinking about the canvas, we've talked about these various metaphors and analogies throughout the show, but the idea of the canvas, the visual field itself as this sort of this space of exploration. I think for some it's a bit of a stretch, but thinking, we talk about an artist like Al Ebanks. There's a very monumental painting that's from our national collection in that final room entitled Migrate. So we've talked about these different oscillations or kind of resonances of cartography and of journeying and voyaging, but thinking in both a literal and a more abstract way about this idea of voyaging, the passages and journeys, the sort of Atlantic passage, and these quite powerful and sort of compelling narratives that are still being confronted in the Caribbean in the kind of context of a decolonial or decolonizing moment where some of these really powerful histories still need kind of addressing in terms of contemporary art.
Yeah. And I think there are many fascinating new possibilities that are opening because of the changing technologies. And Brandon, finally, Brandon, Simon, Caitlin, and so on, I think introduced that in a very interesting way. But of course, there are many ways that one could take them further. Using virtual reality, creating immersive environments, the whole idea of mapping, projecting, and mapping images onto buildings and so on. And there are many possibilities that open themselves. And I think this issue of abstraction too, I think returning to the basic idea of the map is always, it is an abstraction of the world in many ways. So I think it's also a good point of entry to make people understand what abstraction really is. So I think that can also be worked with. But then also again how that changes because of 3D scanning, 3D printing, all the new technologies that allow us, because mapping traditionally has been the translation of a three-dimensional world into a two-dimensional form, and there are now other possibilities there that can do many different things.
Well, I do want to end by saying thank you to the other artists that we haven't referenced. So we have Randy Cholette, Nasara Suku Cholette, David Bridgman I mentioned, Chris Mann, Linda McCann. I'm going through this in my mind to make sure that I'm not missing anyone. Simon Tatum we have spoken about. Am I missing
Ian McRae.
Ian McRae, yep.
And
another young, very exciting artist working in the Cayman Islands.
And works, I think, also another collaborative project, works, as we've said, from the National Collection, from the National Galleries collection, also the National Archives, and borrowed from, even we've got some facsimiles reproduced with permission from the British Library. So it's really nice to see this sort of collaborative.
The National Museum, of course, that we've already referenced as well. And I think we do try very hard to ensure our projects at the National Gallery do have these collaborations and partnerships to expand the conversation, to wider audiences, to support institutional collaboration as well. So very, very large thank you to yourselves for tonight, to the artists in the exhibition, to Davenport, who are the sponsors of the exhibition and really have made this possible. And I think we're very excited to be at the very start of a 3-month journey with a very busy and packed program. And a lot of opportunities for taking this conversation forward over the 3 months and beyond. So I'd like to thank all of you tonight for coming out on a Friday evening as well to join us. And yes, looking forward to continuing the dialogue. I would say, do we have any questions from the audience? We could probably end our recording, but open up the floor just in case. I think we answered yours.